A lot of us Christians struggle with sin. And there's this narrative around the world from Christians and non-Christians alike that, God is just meant to be, he's this guy who doesn't like us to have pleasure, right? He doesn't want us to do any of the fun things that we're meant to do, all the fun things of this world. He just wants us to be monks, not do any of the fun things. But they forget that, it's God who created all these pleasures, right? God created all the pleasures, of like nice food, right? Like even like the taboo topic we don't really like to speak about a lot in church, but like the topic of sex, like God created that, right? He's not someone who's like, no, I don't want to see my children, having sex and stuff. Like he created it. He created everything, right? And he created everything for a purpose. But the reason we struggle with pleasure and sin is that our order of things is wrong. We end up putting those things above God. And I just want to start off this video with a passage from Romans 6 verse 16. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but it basically says, Paul was saying, don't you realize that you become a slave to whatever you choose to obey? So those who choose to obey sin, right? You can choose to obey sin and you become a slave to sin, which leads to death. Or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living. Right, and I think that's an important distinction to make there. All these pleasures we have in the world were created by God. They really were. Like God is the reason we're able to have all of these things. They're meant to be enjoyed. But the issue comes when you choose to obey them, as it says in Romans 6 verse 16. The issue comes when you choose to obey them and we make them an idol. Right? It was Jesus who said that. He was saying this to the Pharisees. It was like, don't you know that Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around? Right? Because we have these things that were made for us, right? They were made for our good. But when we start becoming, obsessed, or we stop putting things in the right order, right? When we stop putting God above everything else, that's when things start to become blurry, and that's when we end up becoming slaves to them. Because as Paul says, don't you realize that you become a slave to whatever you choose to obey? If you choose to start obeying your pleasures and you choose to start obeying sin, it leads to death. But you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living, right? It was Jesus who said, anyone who drinks of the water of this earth will thirst again, but anyone who drinks my water will never thirst again. I think it's important for us to realize that distinction. One, pleasures were created by God for us to enjoy. But two, it's important to remember they were created for us, not the other way around. We cannot become a slave to them, because we will die, like it leads to death, as Paul was saying. We should choose to obey God, who leads to righteous living. Now, that's a very difficult. It's difficult for us it's a difficult concept for us to grasp, because we're humans, right? We fall into sin and temptation very easily, right? But I think it's just important for us to have that distinction, to really have that distinction. It was created by God, and God is not. I think that's what leads to sin, right? That's really what makes us struggle with sin, is that we forget that God is for us, right? We think it's like this battle between God and like what we want in life. No, like it says, I think it's in Romans. I think it's 8:18. If God is for us, who can be against us, right? Jesus said, if you ask your Father for bread, will He give you a snake? No. And I think it's important for us to realize that God and His commandments are not at odds with what's best for us. These pleasures are here for us to enjoy, but we need to make sure that the order remains the same. Because I've spoken about this in a couple of videos before, but when we make things idols, right? And the moral of the story of Abraham and Isaac is that we should sacrifice every source of security and significance to God, because everything else in this world fades, but God is a firm foundation. Now, again, going back to Romans 6:16, if you make pleasures and all the stuff in sin your idol, right? You're bound to die. You will die, because they take from you. Right? Whereas God like pours into you. God is a firm foundation, and we cannot make anything else our idol. I think that's why it's important for us to not live for pleasure, but to remember, as Jesus said, Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around. Right? These pleasures were made for us, not the other way around. And I think an important thing just to tie in with the story of Abraham and Isaac is that, sacrificing, right? A concept I didn't really understand, like fasting that well. Like I kind of knew that, fasting is sacrificing to God, but like I didn't really grasp it until like 2 weeks ago, right? Where I tied it in conjunction with this Abraham Isaac story, where, you're meant to sacrifice every source of security and significance to God. Fasting is a form of you sacrificing every source of security and significance to God, right? Or a source of security and significance, right? Like the food you eat, or if you're somebody who's like, you really love sugar, or you're really dependent on coffee, let's say, right? going like a week without having coffee is sacrificing. You're sacrificing your security, right? Your security wasn't coffee like to keep you going. You're like, no, I'm going to sacrifice this to connect with God, right? That's a form of sacrifice and worship, to just lift God up and be like, God, you're above everything else in my life. My source of security and significance is in you. My source of strength is in you, not in anything else in this world, because everything else will fade, right? But you are a firm foundation. I think that's why it's important for us to fast. And just another thing that ties in with fasting and sacrificing is tithing, right? There's this song that I love called Everything That Has Breath. It's by Jesus Culture, and there's a line where they say, we refuse to bring you an offering that doesn't cost us anything, right? It takes me back to when Jesus was calling out the Pharisees for being hypocrites, right? He's speaking about how like a lot of people, like their sacrifices had become like, people were sacrificing. You're meant to be sacrificing like your best. Like you've got all of this, like you've got all this lamb, all these crops and everything. You've got all these animals. You're meant to be sacrificing like your best goat to God. Again, as a form of like, God, I'm grateful. Like everything comes from you. I'm giving you my best, right? Just to be like, I'm so grateful, Lord, I'm just giving you my best, right? But the Pharisees, right, like these people, so you get these people like, instead of giving their best lamb, they bring a lamb that have got like one of their eyes are like not working properly, or one of their legs is like crooked, or whatever it is. Like they were just bringing something, like just to be like, oh, here you go, God. And this is similar to what the Pharisees were doing and what a lot of us do nowadays, right? The Pharisees had gotten to a place where they were blessed with all this money, but instead of being like, okay, I've gotten all this money, let me give God my best, let me give God first, they were taking and going and spending whatever it is that they wanted, and they were giving God whatever was left over, right? It's similar with us. Like I picture myself, like I can see it. It's something I'm like, damn, I should not do that. Like I can see it happening where, you know, if I get blessed with like a lot of money, I'd be like, you know, I'd really want to like give God, but like actually, you know, it would be really nice like to upgrade the place I'm living at, right? Or I don't really like meal prepping, let me like hire a chef or something. Or dude, I really want to get this new car, like I'd love to get like an Audi R8, like let me get this, let me like, there's so many things, and then whatever's left over, let me give God. But it's meant to be the other way around. We're meant to be grateful and recognize that everything comes from God, and be like, okay, I've gotten all of this, let me give God my best portion. Let me give God my best portion, to the extent that, you know, like obviously you're not gonna give like everything. I mean, ideally you should be like giving everything like spiritually to God, like that's what we should be doing. But in terms of like practically, you know, if you get like a massive check, like you should be able to give as much as you can without like you know, like dying of like starvation or something, right? But you know, that's a really like, that's an extreme. But the point is, we're meant to give God our best portion, not our leftovers. But yeah, that's all I kind of got for this video. You guys let me know what you think of the topic in the comment section below. Make sure you hit subscribe to join the Self-Improvement Brotherhood. Until next time, see you boys.